"Nobody can know you're my wife tonight." Those were the first words my husband said to me when we stepped out of the black sedan and into the bright lights of the Brooks Foundation gala. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The autumn air was cool against my skin, and the entrance of the Grand Crescent Hotel shimmered with golden lights, cameras flashing as guests walked across the red carpet. I adjusted the silver shawl around my shoulders and looked at Thomas, waiting for him to smile and tell me he was joking. He didn't. Instead, he straightened his tuxedo and glanced toward the crowd. "Just stay in the background, Margaret," he said quietly. "Most of these people wouldn't understand." I felt a strange heaviness settle in my chest. We had been married for 43 years. 43 years of raising children, paying mortgages, moving across states for his career, and standing beside him through every success and every setback. Yet somehow, standing beneath those glittering chandeliers, I felt less visible than a stranger walking past us on the sidewalk. I followed him into the ballroom anyway. The room was enormous, larger than any venue I had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Round tables dressed in ivory linens stretched across the floor. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying trays of sparkling drinks. Everywhere I looked, people were laughing, shaking hands, and greeting one another with warmth. Thomas immediately slipped into that world, as though he belonged there more than anyone else. Within minutes, he was surrounded by executives, investors, and community leaders. I stood beside him for a while, waiting to be introduced. It never happened. Whenever someone approached, Thomas shifted slightly, blocking me from the conversation. When one woman asked who I was, he answered before I could speak. "Just family," he said with a quick smile. "Just family." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. Eventually, he pointed toward a small table near the far wall, partially hidden behind a decorative column. "Why don't you sit over there?" he suggested. "It'll be more comfortable." I nodded even, though we both knew comfort had nothing to do with it. From that corner of the ballroom, I watched the evening unfold. The orchestra played softly. Guests raised glasses during speeches. Laughter echoed through the room. Thomas seemed perfectly at ease, moving from group to group, smiling wider than I had seen him smile in years. Not once did he look back at me. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the untouched glass of water in front of me. The ice slowly melted. Around me, conversations blended into a distant hum. I couldn't stop thinking about how familiar this feeling was. Over the years, there had been small moments. Dinners where my ideas became his accomplishments. Meetings where my name was forgotten. Celebrations where I stood just outside the photograph. I had always convinced myself it wasn't intentional. Tonight, sitting alone among hundreds of guests, that excuse no longer felt believable. An hour passed, then another. I considered slipping out quietly and calling a cab home. No one would notice. I glanced toward the ballroom entrance one last time before making my decision. That's when I saw a sudden change ripple through the crowd. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A group of executives hurried toward the doorway. The CEO of Brooks Industries had arrived. Even from across the room, I could feel the energy shift. People stood straighter. Smiles widened. Everyone seemed eager to get his attention. But as the CEO entered the ballroom, he didn't appear interested in the speeches or the applause. Instead, he scanned the room slowly, methodically, as though searching for someone. And for reasons I couldn't explain, the moment his eyes swept across the crowd, I felt a chill run down my spine. The room seemed to lean toward the entrance as the chief executive officer made his way inside. Conversations softened into whispers. Even from across the ballroom, I could see the effect he had on people. Men who had spent the evening speaking confidently suddenly looked nervous. Women who had been laughing moments earlier adjusted their posture and watched him carefully. Yet the man at the center of all that attention appeared distracted. He greeted a few guests politely, shook several hands, and thanked members of the foundation board. Then his eyes continued moving through the crowd. He was searching for someone. I told myself it could not possibly matter to me. People like Daniel Brooks did not spend their evenings looking for women sitting alone behind decorative columns. I lowered my eyes to the table and reached for my water glass. Across the room, Thomas was standing with a group of executives, smiling broadly. For the first time that evening, he looked uneasy. I noticed him glance toward the chief executive officer several times. Then he adjusted his jacket and began moving through the crowd, clearly hoping to intercept him. I watched without much interest. After all these years, I knew Thomas well enough to recognize ambition when I saw it. He had spent most of our marriage chasing the approval of people with influence. Promotions, awards, memberships, titles. Every achievement was another rung on an invisible ladder only he could see. I used to admire that determination. Then somewhere along the way, I realized he valued being admired more than being known. A server approached my table and offered a plate of small desserts. I thanked him and declined. My appetite had disappeared hours ago. The music changed, and a soft piano melody drifted through the ballroom. It reminded me of another event many years earlier. Thomas and I had attended a company dinner shortly after his first major promotion. I had spent weeks helping him prepare presentations and speeches. I remembered staying awake past midnight proofreading documents while he slept. At the dinner, one of his colleagues congratulated him on an idea I had originally suggested at our kitchen table. Thomas accepted the praise without hesitation. On the drive home, I convinced myself it was not important. We were a team, I told myself. His success was our success. Looking back, I wondered how many pieces of myself I had quietly surrendered in moments exactly like that one. A burst of applause pulled me back to the present. Daniel Brooks had reached the center of the ballroom. Several board members surrounded him. Cameras flashed. Yet even while speaking with them, he seemed distracted. His attention kept drifting beyond the crowd, toward the tables, toward the guests no one important was supposed to notice. I looked away again. There was no reason for me to care. The evening would end soon enough. Thomas would collect me on the way out, and we would drive home in silence. Tomorrow would look very much like yesterday. That thought should have comforted me. Instead, it left me feeling unexpectedly tired. I glanced at the ballroom doors and briefly considered leaving without telling anyone. Then I heard someone say my name. Not Margaret. Not Mrs. Whitmore. The name was spoken exactly the way it had been decades ago. Warmly, carefully, as though it belonged to someone worth remembering. I froze. For a second, I thought I had imagined it. Then I heard it again, this time closer. My heart began to beat faster. I turned slowly in my chair. Standing only a few feet away was Daniel Brooks himself. The conversations around us seemed to fade into the background. He looked older than the photographs I had seen in newspapers, but his eyes were unmistakable. Recognition filled his expression. Not uncertainty, not curiosity. Recognition, as though he had finally found something he had been missing for a very long time. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Daniel Brooks simply stood there looking at me with an expression I could not quite understand. Relief, gratitude, perhaps even disbelief. It was the kind of look people wear when they finally find something they thought was gone forever. Around us, conversation slowed. I could feel curious eyes turning in our direction. Daniel smiled first. "Margaret Harper," he said softly. "I cannot believe it is really you." Hearing my maiden name startled me. Very few people still remembered it. I had not used it in more than 4 decades. I rose slowly from my chair. "Mr. Brooks," I said politely, "I think you may have mistaken me for someone else." His smile widened. "No, I have not." He shook his head. "I would recognize you anywhere." Across the ballroom, I noticed Thomas stop in the middle of a conversation. His face tightened as he watched us. He immediately began moving toward our table. Daniel seemed completely unaware of him. His attention remained fixed on me. "I have been looking for you for years," he said. "Longer than you can imagine." My confusion only deepened. "Looking for me?" I asked. "Why?" Before he could answer, one of the board members approached and tried to pull him toward the stage. There was another speech scheduled, another photo opportunity, another obligation competing for his attention. Daniel raised a hand politely. "In a moment," he said. Then he looked back at me. "There is something I have wanted to say for 20 years. The room felt strangely quiet. Not silent, but distant. Like everything beyond our table had moved several feet away. I searched his face for answers. Then a memory surfaced unexpectedly. A small office building. A rainy afternoon. A young entrepreneur sitting across from me with stacks of paperwork spread across a conference table. The image appeared so suddenly that I almost laughed. It had happened decades ago. Long before magazine covers. Long before television interviews. Long before Daniel Brooks became one of the most recognizable business leaders in the country. Back then, he had simply been Daniel. Ambitious, intelligent, determined, and worried. Very worried. "You probably do not remember," I said carefully. "We met a long time ago." Daniel laughed softly. "That is exactly the difference between us. You forgot because it was one afternoon in your life. I remember because it changed mine. My heart skipped. More pieces of that distant memory began returning. At the time, I had worked as a consultant for a regional development group. It was not glamorous work. Most of my days were spent reviewing proposals and helping small businesses solve practical problems. One afternoon, a young man had arrived carrying a business plan everyone else had already rejected. I remembered how exhausted he looked. I remembered how determined he sounded. Most of all, I remembered that everyone around me believed he would fail. Everyone except me. Margaret. Thomas's voice suddenly appeared beside us. I turned. He had finally reached the table. His smile looked forced. Everything all right over here. Daniel glanced toward him briefly. Everything is wonderful, he replied. Thomas extended his hand quickly. Thomas Whitmore. We have met before at several events. Daniel shook it politely, but only for a second. Then his attention returned to me. The dismissal was subtle, yet impossible to miss. I saw Thomas's expression stiffen. For years I had watched people compete for his approval. Tonight, for the first time, someone important seemed completely uninterested in giving it. Daniel looked back at me and smiled again. There is a reason I never stopped searching, he said. Because there would not be a Brooks Industries without the conversation we had that day. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread instantly. Nearby guests exchanged glances. Board members paused mid-conversation. Even Thomas seemed unable to process what he had just heard. And as I stared at Daniel, memories I had not visited in 20 years began returning one by one. The memories returned with surprising clarity. I could almost smell the coffee in that small conference room downtown. Back then, the office occupied the second floor of an aging brick building overlooking a parking lot. Nothing about it suggested that history was about to begin there. I remembered Daniel sitting across from me, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, and his eyes carrying the kind of determination that only appears when someone has exhausted every other option. His proposal had already been rejected by banks, investors, and advisors. The numbers did not impress anyone. The market was crowded. The risks looked enormous. Most people saw a business destined to fail. I saw something different. I saw a man who understood a problem that others had not even noticed yet. At the time, my job involved reviewing struggling projects and helping business owners identify weaknesses in their plans. I spent 3 hours with Daniel that afternoon. We covered every page of his proposal. We talked about operations, customer relationships, long-term growth, and the mistakes hidden inside his original strategy. He listened carefully. He took notes. He asked questions. More importantly, he was willing to change. When the meeting ended, I handed him several pages of recommendations. I never expected to hear from him again. That was the nature of my work. People came and went. Some succeeded. Some disappeared. Life moved forward. Yet standing beside my table all these years later, Daniel seemed to remember every detail. You told me something that day, he said. His voice carried clearly despite the growing crowd around us. You said that the strongest businesses are not built by chasing opportunities. They are built by solving problems people cannot ignore. I blinked in surprise. I had forgotten those exact words. He had not. That sentence changed everything, he continued. I went home and rebuilt the entire company plan from scratch. Around us, more guests were quietly gathering. Curiosity was spreading through the ballroom. Several executives stood nearby pretending not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Thomas remained frozen beside me. I could feel his discomfort growing. For decades, he had controlled the narrative of our marriage. He was the accomplished one. He was the respected one. He was the person people noticed when we entered a room. Tonight, for the first time, that familiar balance felt uncertain. Daniel smiled at me. 3 years later, the company became profitable. 5 years later, we expanded nationally. 10 years later, we were competing with organizations that once laughed at us. He paused. And through all those years, I wanted to thank the woman who gave me the guidance nobody else was willing to offer. I shook my head gently. Daniel, I only did my job. His expression softened. That is exactly what makes this remarkable. You never asked for recognition. You never asked for a position. You never asked for compensation. You simply helped because you believed someone deserved a chance. The words settled heavily inside me. Not because they praised me, but because they reminded me of a version of myself I had almost forgotten. There was a time when people sought my opinion. There was a time when my ideas mattered. Somewhere along the way, buried beneath years of supporting Thomas's ambitions, I had stopped seeing that woman altogether. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document. "I carried this for months," he said quietly, "because I hoped one day I would finally find you." As he unfolded the paper, every eye in the immediate area seemed fixed upon us. And for reasons I could not yet understand, Thomas suddenly looked afraid. Daniel carefully unfolded the document and held it between us. It was not a contract or a business report. It was a yellowed sheet of paper protected inside a clear sleeve. Even from where I stood, I recognized the handwriting immediately. My handwriting. For a second, I could not speak. 20 years earlier, after our meeting, I had written several pages of recommendations by hand because Daniel could not afford the consulting package that normally accompanied a formal review. I had never thought about those notes again. Yet here they were, preserved as if they belonged in a museum. Daniel smiled when he saw the surprise on my face. "I kept them all these years," he said. "Every major decision I made during those early years can be traced back to something written on these pages." The guests closest to us leaned in slightly. No one interrupted. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, I had been invisible. Now people seemed eager to hear every word. Daniel pointed to one section of the document. "This page stayed framed in my office for nearly a decade." He laughed softly. "My executives used to ask who wrote it. I always told them the truth. The smartest advisor I ever met." I felt my cheeks warm. Compliments had never been comfortable for me, especially public ones. I opened my mouth to protest, but Daniel gently shook his head. "Please do not dismiss what you did. The world is full of people who take credit for success. Very few people quietly create it for others." Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Thomas shifting his weight. He forced a smile and stepped closer. "Margaret has always been helpful," he said. "She supported my career for decades as well." The words sounded harmless enough, but I knew what he was doing. He was trying to pull himself back into the story. For years that approach had worked. People naturally assumed my contributions existed only through him. Daniel glanced at Thomas politely. Then he returned his attention to me. The difference was impossible to miss. "Support is valuable," Daniel said. "But what Margaret gave me was leadership." Several people exchanged surprised looks. One woman near the stage actually lowered her glass. Thomas's smile faltered. Daniel continued, "There is something else you should know." He folded the document and placed it back inside his jacket. "For the past year, Brooks Industries has been developing a national mentorship initiative. We searched for experienced advisors with integrity, judgment, and a proven ability to recognize potential in others. We interviewed hundreds of candidates." He paused and looked directly at me. "But the person I wanted most was the woman who helped build my future before there was anything in it for her." My heart began to race. I had no idea where this conversation was heading. Around us, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Daniel smiled again, but this time there was genuine excitement behind it. "Margaret, I have spent months trying to locate you. Former colleagues had retired. Offices had closed. Records had disappeared. More than once I thought I had waited too long." He shook his head. "Then tonight, I walked into this room, and there you were." For the first time all evening, I felt something shift inside me. Not pride, not revenge, something quieter. It felt like recognition, like discovering that a part of myself I thought had vanished was still alive after all these years. And judging by the expression on Thomas's face, he was beginning to realize that the woman he had hidden away all evening was not the woman everyone else was now seeing. The ballroom no longer felt like the same room I had entered earlier that evening. Nothing about the chandeliers or the music had changed, yet somehow everything looked different. Perhaps it was because I was seeing it through different eyes. Or perhaps it was because other people were finally seeing me. Daniel remained beside my table while guests continued gathering nearby. Some introduced themselves. Others simply listened. The conversations that had once flowed around me now seemed to flow toward me instead. It was an unfamiliar feeling. For so many years, I had grown accustomed to standing quietly in the background. Not because I lacked opinions or experience, but because somewhere along the way it had become easier to let others take center stage. Especially Thomas. He had always enjoyed being noticed. I had never minded. At least, not at first. But standing there now, I found myself wondering how many opportunities one had quietly stepped away from simply because someone else expected me to. Daniel seemed to sense my discomfort. You look overwhelmed, he said kindly. I laughed softly. That is because I am. Several people around us smiled. The tension that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place was curiosity, respect, something I had not expected to experience that night. A woman in her 40s stepped forward from the crowd. I recognized her immediately from business magazines. Emily Carter, one of the senior executives at Brooks Industries. She extended her hand warmly. It is an honor to meet you, Margaret. I shook her hand, still unsure how to respond to any of this attention. Emily glanced toward Daniel and smiled. We have heard stories about you for years. I looked at him in disbelief. Stories? Daniel nodded. Quite a few, actually. Emily laughed. Whenever someone asked him about the best business advice he ever received, your name always came up. I felt genuinely speechless. 20 years. 20 years had passed while I assumed that afternoon had been forgotten by everyone except me. Yet somehow the impact had continued traveling far beyond anything I could have imagined. Across the room, Thomas stood alone near one of the cocktail tables. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed particularly interested in speaking with him. Several executives who had surrounded him earlier were now gathered near our conversation instead. I noticed him checking his phone repeatedly, adjusting his jacket, looking for a way back into the center of attention. The sight should have satisfied me. It did not. Surprisingly, I felt no desire for revenge. No desire to embarrass him. What I felt instead was clarity. The kind that arrives quietly after years of confusion. Daniel turned back toward me. There is one more reason I wanted to find you. His expression became more serious. This mentorship initiative I mentioned is launching next quarter. We plan to support entrepreneurs across all 50 states. People with strong ideas but limited opportunities. The same situation I was in all those years ago. He paused. I would like you to help lead it. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. Lead it. I repeated. Daniel nodded. Not as a symbolic figure. Not as an honorary guest. As an advisor. A decision maker. Someone whose judgment we trust. My heart skipped. The proposal felt impossible. I was 68 years old. Most people my age were being encouraged to slow down, retire, and stay comfortably out of the way. Yet here was one of the most successful business leaders in the country offering me a chance to begin something entirely new. Around us, the crowd waited for my response. And for the first time in many years, I realized that the next chapter of my life might be much larger than the one I had been settling for. For several seconds I could not answer. The invitation felt unreal, as though it belonged to someone else standing in my place. I looked around the ballroom. Faces I had never seen before were watching me with genuine interest. Earlier that evening, I had been hidden behind a column. Now some of the most accomplished people in the room seemed to be waiting for my response. Daniel did not rush me. He simply stood there with the calm confidence of someone who had already made his decision. You do not have to answer tonight, he said, but I hope you will consider it. I smiled faintly. You make it sound simple. The best opportunities usually are, he replied. Laughter rippled through the group around us. The tension eased. Yet inside me, something far more significant was happening. For years, my life had become smaller without me fully realizing it. Not because I lacked ability, not because I lacked experience, but because I had slowly accepted limits that were never truly mine. I had convinced myself that my most important contributions were behind me. Standing there now, I began to question that belief. Emily stepped forward again. You should know that this program is important to thousands of people, she said. We are building something designed to create opportunities in communities that are often overlooked. Her words resonated deeply. I thought about the young entrepreneurs Daniel had described. Men and women with good ideas but limited resources. People standing exactly where he once stood. I understood those people, perhaps more than anyone in that room. Before I could respond, Thomas finally joined the conversation. His smile appeared carefully constructed. This is certainly unexpected, he said. Margaret has always been modest about her accomplishments. Daniel nodded politely. That is one of the things I admire most about her. Thomas chuckled, but the sound lacked warmth. Well, after all these years, it is nice to hear someone recognize her contributions. The statement sounded supportive on the surface. Yet I noticed several people exchange glances. They had heard enough of the evening's conversation to understand the unspoken reality. Recognition was not something I had received often at home. For the first time, I realized that I was no longer the only person who could see it. The awareness unsettled Thomas. I could see it in the way he adjusted his cufflinks and shifted his posture. He was accustomed to controlling how others perceived our marriage. Tonight that control was slipping away. Daniel looked toward the stage where organizers were preparing for the next presentation. "There is something else," he said. "The board approved a special recognition award this year." I assumed he was changing the subject. Then he turned toward me. Originally, it was intended for someone else. The crowd grew quiet again. After finding Margaret tonight, I requested a change. My eyes widened. "Daniel, that is not necessary." He smiled. "I disagree." Several board members nearby nodded in approval. One of them spoke up. The motion passed unanimously. A soft wave of applause spread through the surrounding guests. I felt completely unprepared for the moment, not because of the attention, but because of what it represented. The applause was not celebrating a single meeting 20 years ago. It was recognizing something I had forgotten to value in myself: judgment, experience, integrity, the ability to help others succeed. Qualities that had always existed whether anyone acknowledged them or not. As the applause continued, I glanced across the ballroom and met Thomas's eyes. For a brief moment, neither of us looked away. Then I saw something there that I had not seen in years. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to realization. He was beginning to understand that the woman he had spent so long overlooking was no longer willing to disappear. The formal presentation began a few minutes later, but I barely heard the opening remarks. My mind was still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. Earlier that evening, I had been sitting alone behind a column, wondering whether anyone would notice if I quietly slipped out the side door. Now I was seated at the front of the room beside people whose names appeared in national business publications. The contrast felt almost impossible to process. When the chairman of the foundation stepped to the podium, he welcomed the guests and spoke about leadership, innovation, and service. Then he paused and smiled toward our table. "Tonight," he said, "we are recognizing someone whose impact reached far beyond any title or position." The room grew quiet. I felt every eye turn in my direction. Normally, that kind of attention would have made me uncomfortable. Yet something had changed. I was no longer shrinking from the moment. I was simply allowing it to happen. The chairman continued describing the value of mentorship and integrity. He spoke about people who create opportunities for others without expecting recognition in return. With every sentence, I realized he was describing qualities I had spent years dismissing in myself. Qualities I had viewed as ordinary because they came naturally. When he invited me to join him on stage, the applause filled the ballroom. It was not thunderous or dramatic. It was warm, genuine, respectful. As I stood, Daniel offered an encouraging smile. Emily squeezed my hand briefly. Around us, dozens of guests rose to their feet. I walked toward the stage slowly, trying to remain composed. The lights seemed brighter from up there. The room looked larger. Yet for the first time all evening, I did not feel small. The chairman handed me the award and invited me to say a few words. I had not prepared a speech. I had not expected to be standing there at all. For a moment, I looked across the audience. Then I spoke honestly. I thanked the foundation. I thanked Daniel. I spoke about the importance of believing in people before the world gives them permission to believe in themselves. I shared how a single conversation can change a life. Not because one person has all the answers, but because someone chooses to listen. The room remained silent throughout my remarks. Not distracted silence. Attentive silence. The kind that tells you people are truly hearing what you are saying. When I finished, the applause returned. This time it felt different. Less like recognition for the past, and more like an invitation toward the future. After the presentation ended, guests approached from every direction. Some wanted to introduce themselves. Others wanted advice. A few shared stories about mentors who had changed their own lives. The conversations continued for nearly an hour. Throughout it all, Thomas remained unusually quiet. Eventually, he found an opportunity to speak with me alone near the edge of the ballroom. His expression looked uncertain. "I did not know," he said. It was a simple sentence. Yet I understood what he meant. He did not know the extent of my experience. He did not know how many people still remembered my work. More importantly, he did not know who I had remained beneath all those years of silence. I looked at him calmly. "You never asked," I replied. He lowered his eyes. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then someone called my name from across the room. Daniel was waiting with several members of the Mentorship Initiative team. They wanted to discuss ideas for the future. As I turned toward them, I realized something important. The most valuable thing I had regained that night was not recognition. It was possibility. And for the first time in many years, possibility felt limitless. The gala ended later than anyone expected. Guests lingered in small groups, continuing conversations that should have ended an hour earlier. Business cards were exchanged. Future meetings were discussed. New ideas seemed to fill every corner of the ballroom. Yet as the evening drew to a close, I found myself standing quietly near one of the large windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights stretched for miles beneath the night sky. For the first time in years, I felt completely awake. Not excited, not overwhelmed, simply awake. Daniel joined me a few minutes later. He handed me a folder containing information about the mentorship initiative and smiled. "Take your time reviewing everything," he said. "But I hope this is only the beginning." I thanked him sincerely. Before leaving, he shook my hand and added something I would never forget. "Tonight was not about giving you an opportunity, Margaret. It was about returning one that should never have been taken away." After he walked toward the exit, I remained by the window for several moments, reflecting on those words. Eventually, I heard familiar footsteps approaching behind me. Thomas. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence between us felt different than it had in the past. It was no longer filled with assumptions. It was filled with awareness. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I turned toward him. He looked older than he had a few hours earlier. Not physically, emotionally, as though he had spent the evening confronting truths he had avoided for years. "For tonight?" I asked. He shook his head. "For much longer than tonight." I listened without interrupting. "I spent so much time focusing on my own goals that I stopped seeing yours," he continued. "Somewhere along the way I convinced myself that because you never demanded recognition, you did not need it." His voice carried genuine regret. That was unfair. I appreciated the honesty. More than that, I appreciated the effort it must have taken to say those words. But something inside me had changed. Earlier in life, I might have viewed his apology as the ending of the story. I no longer did. Recognition was never what I wanted, I said calmly. I wanted respect. He lowered his eyes. The distinction seemed to land heavily. We left the hotel shortly afterward. The ride home felt strangely peaceful. Neither of us felt pressured to fill the silence. For once, there was nothing left to pretend. A week later, I accepted Daniel's invitation. The mentorship initiative became one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I worked with entrepreneurs from small towns, large cities, and communities that rarely received attention. I listened to ideas. I asked questions. I helped people discover possibilities they could not yet see for themselves. In many ways, it felt like returning to a part of myself I had abandoned years earlier. The most surprising change, however, happened at home. Thomas began asking for my opinion again, not out of obligation, out of genuine interest. Sometimes growth arrives dramatically. Other times it arrives through small conversations at the breakfast table. Looking back now, I realized the most important moment of that evening was not the award, the applause, or even the public recognition. It was the moment I stopped measuring my worth through someone else's attention. The woman who entered that ballroom believed she needed permission to be seen. The woman who left understood something entirely different. Value does not disappear simply because others fail to notice it. Respect does not begin when people finally acknowledge you. It begins the moment you acknowledge yourself. And that turned out to be the greatest opportunity of all. In this emotional family stories drama, a wife attends a prestigious gala only to discover that her husband wants her hidden from the guests. What begins as a night of humiliation soon becomes a powerful journey of recognition, dignity, and self-worth. As the evening unfolds, an influential chief executive officer publicly acknowledges the wife's forgotten contribution to his success, changing the entire atmosphere of the event. Through unexpected revelations, heartfelt conversations, and long-overdue respect, this family story's tale explores how quiet wisdom can shape lives for decades. While the husband struggles to confront difficult truths, the wife rediscovers her confidence and embraces new opportunities. Filled with emotional twists, personal growth, and inspiring moments, this family story's narrative highlights the importance of respect within marriage. Fans of family stories will appreciate the uplifting message, and viewers who enjoy meaningful family stories about second chances, recognition, and personal transformation will find this story unforgettable. Character 1. Margaret Whitmore, 68-year-old white American woman. Silver hair, blue eyes, elegant navy evening gown, front-facing portrait, confident gentle expression, realistic skin texture, professional photography, mature features, natural lighting, high detail, no cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. Thomas Whitmore, 71-year-old white American man. Distinguished face, gray hair, clean-shaven, dark tuxedo, front-facing portrait, reserved expression, realistic skin texture, professional photography, mature features, natural lighting, high detail, no cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. One grand luxury American charity gala ballroom, filled with towering crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, elegant round tables, and hundreds of wealthy guests in formal evening attire. Margaret Whitmore, a 68-year-old white American woman with silver hair, blue eyes, and an elegant navy evening gown, stands alone in the foreground near a massive marble column. Her expression is dignified yet deeply hurt. Thomas Whitmore, a 71-year-old white American man with gray hair, wearing a black tuxedo, stands several feet away, surrounded by executives and influential guests. He intentionally faces away from Margaret while engaging in conversation. The emotional tension between husband and wife dominates the scene. Guests discreetly glance toward Margaret, creating an atmosphere of exclusion and silent judgment. Cinematic lighting, realistic facial expressions, ultra-realistic photography, deep depth of field, luxury environment, emotional storytelling, high drama, Hollywood, cinematic composition, no cartoon, no cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, photorealistic, natural human anatomy, detailed facial features, powerful visual contrast between isolation and social status. 1, 2, center of the same grand gala ballroom during a dramatic turning point. Margaret Whitmore stands confidently beside a distinguished business leader while a large crowd of executives, board members, philanthropists, and guests gather around them. Margaret remains the emotional center of attention. Her posture is calm and composed while admiration spreads through the room. Thomas Whitmore stands several yards away in the background. His expression reveals shocked disbelief and growing realization as attention shifts completely away from him. Crystal chandeliers cast brilliant reflections across the ballroom. Faces throughout the crowd display astonishment, respect, curiosity, and admiration. Luxury tables, elegant decorations, and formal evening wear create an atmosphere of prestige. The emotional reversal is unmistakable. Cinematic perspective, dynamic crowd reactions, powerful storytelling through body language, realistic American gala setting, ultra-realistic photography, high-detail facial expressions, dramatic lighting, Hollywood-style scene, no cartoon, no cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, photorealistic, authentic human proportions, emotional power shift captured in a single cinematic frame. 1, 2, 3 elegant late evening interior beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a breathtaking American city skyline illuminated by thousands of lights. Margaret Whitmore stands in the foreground holding professional documents related to a prestigious mentorship initiative. Her posture is confident, peaceful, and empowered. Her silver hair and elegant navy gown are softly illuminated by warm golden lighting. Thomas Whitmore stands nearby with a thoughtful, reflective expression suggesting personal growth and understanding. The ballroom behind them is gradually emptying as guests depart. Crystal chandeliers glow softly in the distance, creating an atmosphere of closure and renewal. The city skyline symbolizes opportunity and a new chapter. Emotional storytelling through subtle facial expressions and body language. Ultra-realistic photography, cinematic composition, Hollywood drama style, warm color palette, natural lighting, high detail, photorealistic, real human features, no cartoon, no cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Powerful ending scene focused on dignity, respect, redemption, and new beginnings. 1, 2.